And we are back on the build phase. I'm your host, Mr. Ben, and today we are finally going to start our Season 1 and Season 2 Dice Throne Hero full review analysis project that I've been wanting to start working on since like November or something. Whitman is not going to join me for every single one of these character reviews. There's some characters he's not as enthused about as others. But to start this series off, we are starting with my all-time favorite Dice Throne hero, and that is the Shadow Thief. So the first thing I want to do is pull up the Shadow Thief's pamphlet, because we need to go over a couple of things first off. First of all, if you look at the Shadow Thief's dice arrangement, it is 2, 2, 1, 1. That's just about the most punishing dice arrangement you can have. It makes even getting things like his basic attack a little bit more difficult than it is with some other heroes who have like a 3, 2, 1, or really any one of the dice faces being 3 of a kind certainly helps push it. So we're going to move through these status effects here. The first status effect that you see on the Shadow Thief is Shadows. This is arguably one of, if not the strongest, most powerful status effect in the entire game. This is sort of the core of the character. Shadows has a stack limit of 1. It's a positive status effect, so you're only going to apply it to yourself. They will occasionally be stolen from you through transference or whatever else, but that's not what you want to have happen. You want to put these on yourself. When a player with this token would take damage from an offensive roll phase. Now this doesn't count things that fall outside of the offensive roll phase, so it's only going to protect you from the ORP specifically, and it will not protect you from status effects. But if you would take damage from an ORP, no damage is received. Oh! It's the craziest that you just turn off somebody's whole attack. You can basically force them to waste their entire turn with this one status effect. It is excellent. Going from probably the best status effect in the game down to sneak attack. This is roll 1d6 and add the value to your damage. That's right. This is not half the value. This is not like a back strike. This is not like basically every other effect in the game where you roll a dice and have the value and then get a thing. This is the full value, which means this is one of the more swingy, one of the more unreliable status effects. Sometimes you get +6 damage, which is massive. Sometimes you get 1. So this is not going to give you like a consistent damage output, but when it hits hard. I like it a lot. It has a higher ceiling than basically every other damage modifier in the game. And finally, we have Poison. This is a stack limit of 3. This is another fantastic status effect. Really, all the status effects on the Thief's board are very strong. This does 1 damage during the upkeep phase on enemy players, so you inflict this on somebody else, and then it sits around and just damages them over and over and over again. So once you get 3, you're doing 3 damage every turn. That's essentially an isolated source of damage. It does not trigger a defense roll or whatever else, and you don't have to worry about getting hit back by the characters who have the ability to do that kind of stuff. So I want to look at the Thief's board. So this is the overall look of the Shadow Thief board. I really like the artwork. I particularly like the way the skull inside the vial of poison is sort of there but not there. Look, it doesn't look like the glass is etched with that skull. It's the poison itself has this skull-shaped wispiness to it. I like that a great deal. I actually like all the art on this board, and I like basically every one of these abilities. This is, again, my favorite character in the entire game. So let's go ahead and dive right into that. We're going to slide that away. Start over here with Dagger Strike. So this is the basic attack, and while every hero has a basic attack, this one might on surface level look pretty strong. You go 4, 6, 8, which is a higher damage jump than you typically see with most heroes, and you end up at an 8 with the full damage for the Dagger Strike, which is really good. The drawback, again, though, we need to remember is that there are only 2 of the dagger faces on the Shadow Thief's die. So in order to get this, you're going to have a lower % chance than you would with other heroes who are chasing their basic attack. Now, the basic attack for the Shadow Thief is still quite good. So I want to touch on the upgrade here for the Dagger Strike as well. It costs nothing. So you do have to spend a card out of your hand to get it, but other than that, it doesn't cost you anything else. There's really no reason to do it. It makes the CP gain automatic, and if you roll, it also gives you the ability to draw an extra card. Now, rolling a 6 with a dagger, there's times on turn 1 where I will keep a dagger strike just because I got a 6 and enough daggers to get it off. Being able to inflict poison is very strong, and if you kind of factor that in, even if you're only doing 4 damage on the attack, now I admit there's some characters where sending in a 4 damage attack is an extremely poor idea. Looking at you, Pyromancer. But even if you're getting a small amount of damage, if that poison sticks around, you're getting that chip damage, that little dot every single turn. It's very, very effective. Next, moving on to Shifty Strike. So this is the small straight on the Shadow Thief. You gain 3 CP and then deal half your CP as damage. You're going to use this power during the game. It's particularly good. I actually really like this power a lot when you're getting started in Dice Throne Adventures. It's not that hard to get. It's not as fragile as a large straight is, although this character is definitely susceptible from some dice manipulation from your opponent. So I would often, if I'm playing Shadow Thief in 1v1, I'll take a Shifty Strike and I won't even chase the Insidious Strike. I'll present it with rerolls left just to avoid being in that position where I have no rerolls and my opponent can throw out some dice fixing. So the CP gain is good. The damage is decent. This isn't like your favorite power on this character board, but it's certainly something you're going to be doing somewhat frequently. The upgrade takes you up to 4 CP, which is definitely decent, and you get the Shadow Strike ability, which it's not ideal. Shadow Strike is the kind of power that you're really only going to use if you were chasing something else and you fall back to this. So for these 2 reasons, it costs 2. It doesn't actually do that much for you, and the backup ability is not something I would ever really want to chase after. I almost always sell this upgrade. Not always, but pretty frequently. Moving down to Pickpocket. This is probably what you could rightfully call the actual basic attack on the Shadow Thief board. Now, this doesn't produce an attack. This only produces CP for you, so it's not actually as good. Wrong phrasing. It's not actually a basic attack, but this is sort of the basic activation. So again, remembering the Shadow Thief's board, there's still only 2 bags, but the minimum activation for this one is 2, whereas with Dagger Strike, it's 3. So you do get this with a higher percentage of success. If you need it, you need it. And this is a reliable way for the Shadow Thief to scoop up a bunch of CP and not have to put himself at risk of defense values that could potentially be harmful early in the game when you're in that kind of building phase. Now, when I play Shadow Thief, I tend to think of my play as 3 phases. Phase 1, I'm trying to see a lot of cards. I'm trying to draw as much as I can, and I'll get to that a little bit later. Phase 2 is building CP, because ultimately your finishing move is the next power we're going to talk about here. But for phase 2, Pickpocket is very useful. The disruption also can't be undervalued. Sometimes it's worth it, much like with the Dagger Strike. If you get the 6 and you have a couple of daggers, maybe it's worth it to go after that just for the poison, even if the initial dagger damage isn't that high. Pickpocket kind of does a similar thing. Even if you don't necessarily really need the CP, maybe it's not the most powerful thing that you have, but if you can steal a CP from your opponent when they only have 1 left, if you can take them from 1 to 0, that is massively powerful. Of course, this is much weaker if somebody has 6 CP and you're only taking 1 away. But there are times where going after the Pickpocket simply because it drains 1 CP from your opponent is, I think, the correct line of play. Now, looking at the upgrade for this card, you get 1 more CP at each level, as well as having a max out value that goes up to 6, which that's a lot of CP to generate on a single turn, but you're not... It depends on what you want as a player, how valuable that is. 6 CP in 1 turn is massive. But if you're not dealing any damage, what kind of a matchup is this? The Shadow Thief is a control character, so he has the ability to play a little slower and take some of these more passive turns and get away with it more easily than some other characters in the game. But still, you always have to keep your eye on the prize here. This is some of my favorite card art too. The flipping the coin on his fingers like a poker chip. Stealing 2 from your opponent, definitely good. This is an upgrade I will often take unless it's the late game. Once you get into the late game, if you're already past phase 2 and you're into phase 3, this upgrade's an automatic sell. In phase 1 or 2, so the early and the mid game, I often will play this one. Moving over to Insidious Strike. Now this is your bread and butter power. This is the power that matters absolutely the most in Dice Throne Adventure, and it's probably the most important power in 1v1. Well, it's up there. So once you get maxed out in its base form, the 3 CP gain is great. The 4 CP gain on the upgrade is definitely better, but it's going to cost you 2 CP plus a card to get there. So you're going to need to activate this several times in order to really have it pay you back. If you think about it, gives you 1 extra CP each turn, but it costs you 2 CP plus a card, which means you're going to need to activate it 3 times to actually see like a return on that investment. That's not great. Now in Dice Throne Adventures, you have all the time in the world. It's absolutely worth it. And the shank attack, backup power for those times when the dice just aren't being friendly to you, is totally viable, particularly in Dice Throne Adventure. In 1 versus 1, I do not want to play this power. I don't want to use shank attack because it's too passive. Again, if I'm there's certainly times where inflicting a poison is worth it, but this is not something I'm going to chase after. So again, this is an upgrade. In Dice Throne Adventures, I take this one every time. In a competitive game, if it's the middle of the game, if it's kind of in that mid state of the game where I've got enough CP that I have like a surplus of CP and I can get this down without really missing a beat. It's almost those games where I have so much CP that I have to put it somewhere. Those are the games where I'll totally play this upgrade. Most of the time, though, it just doesn't have a home because I don't want to take the time to play it and then chase straights, because especially playing against another person who's going to be using dice manipulation cards, getting your large straight consistently is much harder in 1 versus 1 than it is in Dice Throne Adventures. It's not impossible. It's still not a super hard thing to do, but it is not as easy. We're going to touch on the ultimate here. This character. So in this kind of in the same way that his basic attack is much harder to get than a basic attack for basically any other character, this ultimate is kind of weird too. So you gain 3 CP, so that essentially has the same effect as both of the straight options on the Shadow Thieves board. You gain the 3 CP, and then you deal CP as damage plus 5. So you can do the math. If you max out on CP, that's a 20 damage ultimate, which is massive. But if you get this early game, if you nat roll an ultimate on like turn 2 and you have 3 CP, your ultimate is like 8 damage, which is not awesome. So the Shadow Thief's ultimate, now you do gain shadows off of it, which it's hard to ever complain about gaining shadows, but this is like everything else with this character. More than any other character in the game, the answer to the question, like, well, is this good? The answer is it depends. Like everything that happens on the Shadow Thief's board and all of his play patterns, it depends on what stage of the game you're in. It depends on what the composition of your hand is. There's nothing that is reliably powerful about the Shadow Thief other than the framework in which he exists. Moving on to Shadow Dance. Get 3 6s. So I think this is the only character in the game who starts with the micro ult printed on their board. Get 3 6s. You throw a dice, do half the damage, half the value is pure damage, which maxes out at 3, which isn't great, but you have to keep in mind you're pairing that 3 maximum damage with the most powerful status effect in the game and a sneak attack, which could potentially add anywhere from 1 to 6 damage to one of your subsequent attacks. So even though, again, I touched on this before, even though this is one of those times where kind of the overt power isn't that strong, it's all the after effects. And this is what makes the Shadow Thief so compelling to me as a character, is you have to be thinking a few turns ahead. You have to really be planning your turns out and thinking, okay, if I get sneak attack this turn, then next turn I have to be able to activate something that deals damage so I can actually use the sneak attack and it doesn't get wasted. Because it's a terrible feeling when you get a roll that will produce a sneak attack and you can't use it because you weren't able to use the one that you already had on you. This is a very strong power. I find myself using this power at least once in most games. It also, the upgrade, it adds a card draw. Drawing cards is something I really, really like, but is it worth it? I mean, if you play this once, I guess if you activate it twice after you play it, you've essentially got your money's worth. If I'm at that part of the game where I have so much CP that I don't know what to do with it and it needs to go somewhere, then I will probably play this. I'll play this every time in Dice Throne Adventures, but early game, this is not something I really want to throw out there. It is cheap, but early game, my resources need to be going elsewhere. Moving on to the absolute best defense in the entire game, Shadow Defense. This is my favorite power. Well, that's maybe not true. This is my second favorite power. So the upgrade for the Shadow Defense definitely makes it better. You go from 4 dice to 5 dice. If you roll 2 daggers, you inflict a poison. This can be your most common method of inflicting poison in my experience. If you roll 1 6, you get a sneak attack, which is great. And if you roll 2 6s, you get a sneak attack and you step into the shadows and essentially cancel the opponent's incoming damage. Now, it really sucks when you roll those 6s and your opponent immediately follows it up with bye-bye. That hurts my heart parts. I don't like it very much, but that is only going to happen once per game at most. This power is so good, and played with the rest of the tapestry of the Shadow Thief, you're going to be drawing so many cards that having those dice fixing cards necessary to be able to pull those 6s out on your turn, like on your defense turn, it's great. It just... This card is so good, or this power is so good. This upgrade is the single most important upgrade for the entire Shadow Thief. If you don't play another upgrade on the board, I think it's this one. I think Dagger Strike and the next card we're about to talk about are the 3 critical upgrades. And finally, this is actually my favorite power. Cardicopia. I think the best turn 1 in the game you can have for the Shadow Thief is to pay 2 CP on turn 1, put down the Cardicopia upgrade, and then roll 5 cards. Roll 5 5s. Why do I say that? Well, this is all about phase 1. So I mentioned before that I think the Shadow Thief play pattern essentially breaks down into 3 phases. Well, phase 1 is drawing cards, and there's no power in the entire game that is better at drawing cards than Cardicopia. This thing can potentially let you draw 5 cards. This could let you draw 3 cards plus force your opponent to discard 1 randomly. Also, it can be a little bit of a CP gain, although the CP gain I'm not super crazy about. Forcing your opponent to discard a card randomly is extremely powerful, especially for a character that wants to go into the late game and have all the tools ready to be able to be rolling vulnerable things like straights. Forcing your opponent to discard their helping hands, their twice as wilds, it just feels fantastic. But the core value with Cardicopia is filling your hand with cards. So in phase 1, you're drawing as many cards as you can. You're looking at as many different cards, and you're seeding your hand with those dice fixing cards that you're ultimately going to use in phase 3 to ensure that you can just apply tons of damage. If you draw more cards than you can keep in your hand, like if you're up at 6, 7, 8, 9 cards, who cares? Sell them for CP. Phase 2 with the Shadow Thief is generating maximum CP. That way your straights or potentially your ultimates, depending upon how many dice fixing cards you've been able to keep in your hand, those things are going to hit harder by having the most CP. So Cardicopia is the best ability for what it does, which is drawing cards. And phase 1 of the Shadow Thief's play is always about drawing cards. You want to draw as many cards as possible for the first few turns of the game before you transition into generating as much CP as possible, before you transition into generating as much damage as possible. And it's the interplay between these different phases of the game and knowing when you need to make the turn and when you can spend that CP. All of that is why I love this character so much. Yes, it is a lot of decisions. It's more decisions than probably any other character in the game. Maybe Huntress, she has a lot of tough decision points too, but they're compelling decisions, and they're generally decisions made from a place of being spoiled for choice. You've got so many cards in your hand, which one do I play? As opposed to having to make those really tough, like if you look at the Moon Elf play pattern, she often has to make some tough choices about where to put her CP because she has such little CP generation. So there's a scarcity of this resource, so it makes it really important the few places where you choose to invest it. Shadow Thief is the opposite side of that. This guy will smother you in resources. He will drown you in cards and bury you in CP, and you have to navigate this overabundance of resources to make sure that you're doing the right moves at the right time, and it's pretty easy to screw it up. His defense is kind of feast or famine. If you hit shadows, you take no damage, and if you don't hit shadows, you take all the damage. Now, we do have one more power we need to talk about here, And somewhat fittingly, I went on and on before we even got to it. This power, I almost never roll. There's very, 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 very few scenarios where I will ever roll this power. If my opponent is tacking in and I have the ability to potentially deal lethal damage on my defense, sure, I'll roll Counter Strike there. Outside of that very narrow situation, I am never going to choose this. You're barely more likely to inflict a poison here than you are here. So I would actually rather roll here and have the potential to cancel the entire attack and inflict a poison than roll here, hoping for this itsy bitsy little bits of chip damage. This upgrade costs 4 CP if you factor in the fact that it is itself a card that's potentially a 5th CP, so really it costs 5 to get this onto the board. It does double the amount of damage output that you have, but this isn't how you want to do your damage. This isn't how you want to play this character. This isn't how I want to play this character. When I first started playing Shadow Thief, I absolutely did lean into Counter-Strike, and I almost never felt good about making that decision. So overall, I don't think there's hardly any reason to play Counter-Strike. Maybe you play the upgrade in Dice Throne Adventures when you're just trying to get it out of your deck. So when you're on your second or third trip through your deck, you're drawing more loot cards and you don't have to look at this garbage. I do not like Counter-Strike. Again, you can't totally write it off because there are situations where it will win you the game. So you need to be aware of it. It needs to be on your radar. You need to take it seriously as a power. But the vast majority of the time, this upgrade is an automatic sell, and this power is a bit of a dud. Last thing I want to talk about before we move into some of the character-specific cards. This flavor text is not ideal. Entering the shadows is my safe space. Safe space to shank you. Not a huge fan of that flavor text, I must say. To move, although it's one of those things where it's so cheesy, I kind of actually like it. Moving here into some of the Shadow Thief specific cards. Pay 1 CP to gain a sneak attack. Very, very rarely will I play this. So the scenario where I want to play this is where I'm in the late game. I have already developed my hand. I have already developed my coin purse. So I have enough CP that I'm not trying to save it up. And I don't already have a sneak attack, which is pretty unusual. Generally speaking, once I'm into the phase 3 part of the game, I'm gaining sneak attack off my defense roll every turn. Just, it happens for free. I don't have to pay a CP for it. And again, you have to, with this character more than most, you have to factor in the fact that selling the card is also worth a CP. So you almost have to add 1 to the cost of every card in the Shadow Thief's kit to kind of get a fair comparison as far as how it interacts with his overall play pattern. And this one, it just doesn't make the cut most of the time. I will say there are situations where it does make sense. Like, again, if you can spend the CP on this and that's not taking damage off of your attack, cool, but then it's almost win more. And again, if you're at that part of the game where you're able to kind of do whatever you want, well, then you're probably doing whatever you want on your defense phase, in which case you already have a sneak attack, so you might as well sell this. I do not play this card very often. Poison Wound. This kind of falls into the exact same category of criticism as I had for the previous card that we looked at. When things are going the way I want in my game, I'm inflicting poisons with my defense rolls. I'm inflicting poisons with the Cardicopia upgrade bonus. I'm inflicting poisons with Dagger Strike. 3 CP to inflict a poison is not great. Against a character who doesn't have a built-in way to remove status, so like the Monk has Cleanse, or I think the Seraph has Cleanse as well. Those characters, this card's even worse. It's an automatic sell. Characters that don't have built-in ways to remove this, if you want to play it on, like, if you don't have anything else to do with your CP on like turn 1 or 2, maybe this one gets sold a lot. I rarely will play this card. I do really love the art though. Wild Shadows. This card is excellent. This card is absolutely excellent. It's very expensive. 4 CP essentially for a so wild. If you're in the shadows, it counts as a twice as wild. In the late game, you're going to have the 4 CP, and in the late game, you're going to be in the shadows. So this is essentially a slightly overcosted twice as wild with an emergency break that you can pull if you're not in the shadows, and it's not as good, but who wouldn't want another twice as wild in their deck? Who wouldn't want another so wild in their deck? This card is fantastic, if very expensive. Shadow Coin. In its worst case scenario, this is getting paid. In its best case scenario, it's getting paid +1. You play this a lot. You'll never sell this card. It would make no sense to sell a card that costs 0 and gives you 2 CP. So you're going to play this every game where you see it. Sometimes you want to hold it until you can play it in the shadows. That's not often. Most of the time you can just play it and get away with it and it's no problem. But there are going to be some games where you have to make kind of a hard choice between playing it now on this turn, paying for something, and sacrificing the long-term bigger gain of 1 CP. It's, again, kind of an edge case, but something to keep in mind. Best card in the game. If you notice, the frame that I made for my video here is specifically this card. This is absolutely the best card in the game. It's very expensive. 4 CP is a lot to pay for anything, but it's instant speed. You can play this. You can let your opponent think that you missed your defense roll, and then they add a bunch of extra damage to their attack, and then you pay 4 CP and step into the shadows, and it's all wasted. This card, not only is it super powerful as a card, it is a morale breaker. It does suck when you pay 4 CP, put a shadows on yourself, and then somebody buys you. That hurts the soul. But that card is fantastic. Probably easily my favorite card in the game. Card Trick. So this is another one that has some kind of interesting play patterns to it, because for 2 CP, forcing your opponent to discard 1 randomly and drawing 1 card is it's kind of negligible. It's almost like a lateral movement. But there's times where if your opponent only has 1 card in their hand, forcing them to have no options and putting them into top deck mode, that can be worth it just for the 2 CP. There's also times where you need to sit on this and hold it until you can get the 2 card draw by being in shadows. So this card has utility in the early game, it has utility in the late game, and knowing the right time to deploy it is genuinely a difficult puzzle to solve. Usually, I like to save this for the times where my opponent is low on resources, and I play this more as a disruption card than I do a resource generation card for myself. So I often will opt to use this to force my opponent from 1 card to 0, even if it means I only get to draw 1 card, rather than sitting around and waiting to guarantee that I get maximum card draw. I like forcing, particularly when my opponent's sitting on like 1 CP and they've got 1 card in hand. What do you think that is? Could it be a Tibbet? Could it be a Helping Hand? These are the kind of cards that people keep camped out on in their hand so they can use it to stop you from getting an ultimate. And Card Trick is the kind of card that can punish somebody for trying to save that emergency break. Now, if somebody's got a hand of 5 cards, probably I'm not going to do this. It is a random discard, so even when they have some filler in their hand, this thing can still occasionally hit the money card. But overall, the timing of when to use it, I think you should be very deliberate and careful when you deploy this one, because just kind of randomly having your opponent discard a card and drawing 1, it's sort of like you're paying 2 CP to take a step sideways. You're not really advancing your game state, and you might not be inhibiting your opponents. So you want to really think about when this one comes down. This could be anywhere from kind of a nothing burger to a game deciding card, depending upon how it's deployed. And finally, the promo card for the Shadow Thief, Shadow Meld. Like all the other promo cards, it costs 0, you roll a d6, and on a specific result, a good thing happens, and on every other result, you draw a card. So the good thing that happens on this one is you gain a sneak attack and 2 CP. That is excellent. That is truly excellent. Getting a sneak attack for free as well as 2 CP feels very strong. Now, most of the time with most promo cards, you roll the dice and you end up drawing 1, and they just replace themselves. But as far as promo cards go, I like this one a great deal. So that is all the effects on the Shadow Thief board. Now, just to kind of refresh again, you got to think about this guy, or you can play however you want. But to kind of lay out my philosophy on how this guy works, I think the way somebody should play him is you start off by trying to hit Cardicopia and get extra resources in your hand. You want to play the cards that let you draw more cards as quickly as possible. Even if it means overloading your hand, that's fine. Because phase 2 is generating CP. Once you get up to about 10 CP, like 4 or 5 cards in hand consistently, and you can kind of maintain that board state, then you start hunting straights, you start hunting ultimates, you deploy your resources judiciously. It's okay to take damage with Shadow Thief. It's fine, as long as you have the ability to pull that e-brake and hit those 2 6s when you need to step into the shadows. You gotta really be careful in how you deploy your resources with the Shadow Thief, because if you expend too many cards from hand, then you don't have the ability to build back up as easily. If you burn through all your CP, maybe you have a bunch of cards, but they're trapped in your hand because you can't get them out. So you've got to think about pacing, and you've got to think a couple turns ahead. And that's what I like about this character so much. I think that's why he's so strong. Shadow Thief has the ability to do some of the highest damage numbers in the entire game. Not quickly, not like Pyromancer, not like Artificer, these characters that come out going 99 miles an hour, just running through people. He doesn't work that way. But if you give him enough turns, he can be dropping 20 damage bombs on your head, and he can do it consistently, turn after turn after turn, and there's not a lot you can do to stop it. So I really like this character, more than any other, feels like you're kind of building an engine. You're building your way towards something as you're playing the game, and once you get your thing built, devastation occurs. It kind of reminds me of like a Fantastic Four comic, where the Thing and Human Torch and Sue all have to kind of hold everybody off while Reed's trying to come up with the invention that is going to save the day. And the way the Shadow Thief plays is you've got to be confident but judicious in how you deploy your resources throughout the first 3, 4, 5 turns of the game, and then you can just turn on your opponent and smash them. And it's so delicious. Absolutely my favorite character in the game, and it's not even close. All right, go win some games.